My wife kissed me at 7:12 that morning, and at 7:40 she helped my brother remove me from the company that carried my father's name. She did it without raising her voice. That was the worst part. If she had screamed, if Julian had pounded the table, if someone had broken something, I might have forgiven them for being ordinary. But nothing broke. The espresso machine in the boardroom hummed. The winter light from the lake lay flat across the glass wall. My wife adjusted the cuff of her gray jacket, slid a folder toward the chairman, and said, in the same calm tone she used when asking whether I wanted red or white with dinner, "For the record, I recommend an immediate suspension of Adrian Sorrell's executive authority until the internal review is complete." My younger brother did not look at me when he thanked her. He looked at the men from Zurich, at the investors, at the future. I sat there and watched my life become paperwork. Our atelier had restored watches for museums, estates, and men rich enough to confuse obsession with culture. My grandfather repaired railway chronometers in a room above a bakery in Lausanne. My father, Henri Sorel, turned that room into a business with a brass plate, then a townhouse near the Rhône, then a reputation that crossed oceans. By the time the name reached me, Sorel meant discretion, patience, and a kind of accuracy that wealthy people trusted more than priests. Julian always liked the visible part of that inheritance: the dinners, the collectors, the auction houses, the articles that called us guardians of time as if we were prophets instead of mechanics with better suits. I liked the workbench. I liked the smell of oil, old leather, dust inside antique cases. I liked the quiet tick that comes back to life after a movement has been dead for 60 years. My father said Julian was born wanting applause, and I was born listening for what failed behind the curtain. He said it once in my hearing after too much Armagnac. Julian laughed. I pretended not to understand. Claire, who was still only the lawyer we retained for an inheritance dispute then, watched my father over the rim of her glass and said nothing. She always understood more than she admitted. When my father died, he left us the business in equal shares. That is the simple version. The true version had conditions, appendices, private letters, and the kind of old-fashioned safeguards men like my father believed were nobler than trust. The company was split equally between Julian and me, yes. But control of the archive, the restoration ledgers, and the registered Sorel certification seal passed to the acting chief conservator. That was me. It had been me for 11 years. The seal was not ceremonial. Without it, a Sorel certificate was stationary. With it, a watch could gain 100,000 francs in value because collectors do not just buy metal and history, they buy certainty. They buy a line of handwriting that tells them some careful man spent 6 weeks proving the bridge was original, the dial refinished in 1948 rather than 1972, the replaced spring period correct, the provenance intact. My father gave me the soul of the company. He gave Julian the stage and expected gratitude to keep him gentle. My father was a very precise man. He made one imprecise mistake. By the time he died, Claire had already become my wife. People assumed I married her because she was beautiful in the controlled way Geneva rewards. That helped. She moved through rooms without ever seeming to enter them. Men lowered their voices around her, and women never underestimated her twice. But I married her because she saw structure where other people saw sentiment. The first night we spoke properly was after a dinner for a museum board. She stood in the courtyard with her heels in one hand and asked me why I kept correcting people when they called our workshop a maison. "Because it isn't fashion," I said. "No," she answered. "It's power pretending to be craftsmanship." That was the exact kind of sentence I had waited years to hear from someone. I loved her for it. Maybe I still do in the parts of myself that should have died. For 7 years we were careful with one another. Not soft. Careful. There is a difference. We learned each other in the narrow spaces between demands. She knew when I had been bent too long over a movement because I started answering questions 3 seconds late. I knew when something in her had turned cold because she became even more polite than usual. We lost a child in the 4th year, a son at 19 weeks. After that, there was a room in our marriage we both avoided. Not empty, locked. We still had dinners. We still hosted clients. We still touched each other with the practiced tenderness of people who remembered their original language, but had begun conducting negotiations in another one. Julian entered that silence the way damp enters old walls. Not dramatically, naturally. He began by saving me from things I did not know were being counted against me. Late arrivals to investor lunches because a regulator had called about customs valuation. Missed calls from Hong Kong because I had my hands inside an 1820 Breguet and did not hear the phone. Claire would say, "Julian covered it," and I would nod because I thought that was what younger brothers did when grief had made older ones narrower than usual. Then came the changes. A hospitality suite at Basel, a private dinner series with auction specialists, a glossy campaign about legacy, innovation, expansion. Words Julian loved because they meant money without smelling of it. He moved clients toward spectacle. I moved work toward truth. At first, those two things still met in the middle. Then they stopped. The boardroom vote took 11 minutes. The documents Claire presented took less. A memo alleging material concerns about unauthorized side agreements with private collectors. A psychiatric evaluation recommendation disguised as concern over compulsive behavior and isolation. A draft resolution appointing Julian interim executive chairman pending review. It would have been almost elegant if it had not been so lazy in its cruelty. They used my grief, my habits, my preference for the bench over the ballroom, and shaped them into a man investors could fear. The chairman, a bloodless man named Keller who owed his entire career to never being the first person blamed, cleared his throat and asked whether I wished to respond. Claire finally looked at me then. I waited for some private signal, a crack in the performance, a message hidden under the tablecloth of her face. There was nothing, only professionalism, only distance. It was not rage I felt. Rage would have been clean. What I felt was recognition. I had been abandoned earlier than this. This was only the paperwork. "I'd like copies of everything," I said. Julian answered before Keller could. "Of course. No one is trying to hurt you, Adrian." That almost made me smile. No one says that unless harm is already agreed upon. I left the boardroom with a leather folder under my arm and the particular stillness that comes when humiliation is too large to fit inside the body at first. The receptionist gave me the kind of sympathetic look reserved for widowers and men leaving oncologists' offices. In the lift, my reflection looked composed enough to reassure a stranger. I was grateful for that. My father had despised public disarray. "Collapse at home," he once told me. "Never in a corridor." At home, the apartment was half empty. That was Claire's second act. Her blue suitcase was gone from the dressing room. So were 2 framed photographs from the shelf in the study, the silver-backed hairbrush my mother gave her, and the black wool coat I always liked because it made her look like a woman in an older century deciding whether to forgive someone. She had left the shirts I bought her in Naples and taken the watch I repaired for her on our first anniversary. It was a small gold Patek from the 1960s. I had spent 6 nights restoring the clasp. She knew what that watch meant. On the kitchen island, there was an envelope. No note. Just a card from her firm confirming she had retained independent counsel regarding marital dissolution, division of assets, and reputational protection in light of ongoing governance concerns at Sorel Atelier. Reputational protection. That was Claire. Even betrayal came invoiced in the correct language. I poured myself water and stood there until dark. At 9:17, my phone vibrated once. A message from Julian. This did not have to become ugly. Get some sleep. "We will talk tomorrow." I did not answer. Instead, I went downstairs to the private room beneath the apartment where my father had kept the historical ledgers, seals, and working notebooks since before I was born. The room was narrow and climate-controlled, lined with steel drawers and walnut cabinets. It smelled like paper, brass, and the dry patience of dead men. My father used to say the archive mattered more than the workshop, because a watch can be repaired twice, but a lie about its history enters the bloodstream forever. The main certification seal was still where it belonged. So were the 19th century books. So were my father's ledgers. What was missing was more instructive. Drawer C7 contained scanned access cards for the last 5 years and backup keys for 2 external vaults. The envelope for one vault had been opened and resealed. Carefully. Not carefully enough. I checked the access logs. Someone had entered the archive 3 nights earlier at 22:11 using Claire's temporary authorization. That was the hour she had told me she was having dinner with a compliance partner from London. I sat down on the stool at my father's old desk and let that settle in the dark. Claire in this room. Claire opening a vault envelope. Claire not telling me. The affair would have been vulgar enough. This was worse. This was collaboration. Some men break your heart because they are weak. Others because they are building a bridge over your chest and need you flat. By midnight, I understood the broad shape, though not yet every detail. Julian needed more than my suspension. He needed the seal, the ledgers, and enough control over the story to make investors believe they were buying continuity rather than theft. Claire had given him a legal frame. He had given her momentum. Perhaps he had also given her what I had not in recent years: appetite, visibility, a future with cleaner edges. I would have asked when it began, but truthfully that question belongs to people who still hope chronology might redeem intent. By morning I had stopped caring when. I cared how much. So I called Marta Vollen. Marta had been my father's notary, then ours. Then effectively the only person in Geneva who could make billionaires wait in hallways without raising her voice. She was 72, walked with a silver-handled cane she did not need, and had once told me, "Never mistake family secrecy for family loyalty. They are cousins at best." She listened without interruption while I summarized the suspension, Claire's departure, and the tampered envelope. When I finished, she said, "Come now. Bring all relevant documents. Leave sentiment at home." I obeyed. Marta's office overlooked a square full of bare trees and expensive silence. She read quickly, tapping the desk once whenever she found something that interested her. After 40 minutes, she removed her glasses and asked only one question. "Did you sign anything in the last 6 months without reading the appendices yourself?" "No." "Did Claire ever obtain power of attorney over your personal holdings?" "No." "Good. Then your brother is ambitious, not yet competent." She opened a safe built into the wall and withdrew a sealed packet with my father's handwriting on the front. "For Marta only, if Adrian is removed by force or fraud." I stared at it for a full second before she slid it across the desk. "You were not meant to know it existed," she said. "Your father believed contingency plans lose their value when sons begin leaning on them." Inside was a letter and 2 documents. The letter was short. "Adrian, if you are reading this, then either I was unfair to your brother or not unfair enough." The registered trademark for the Sorel name and dial seal remains attached to the custodianship of the archive, not to the corporate entity, and may be withdrawn immediately upon evidence of falsified provenance, unauthorized transfer, or coercive governance. If Julian ever tries to own the house by setting fire to the foundation, do not argue with him. Move the foundation. The first document confirmed exactly that. The second was a transfer mechanism allowing the archive, name rights, and certification authority to be moved into an independent trust under the guardianship of a museum consortium and a private conservator. "You," Marta said, answering the thought on my face. "If I invoke this, I asked. The company becomes a shell? If you invoke this lawfully, she replied, the company becomes what your father wanted it to be without the archive, an office with invoices. I sat very still. Revenge arrived then, not as heat, but as geometry. Julian had built his coup on the assumption that removing me from the board removed me from the marrow. Claire had helped him because she believed systems obey the visible signature. Both of them had confused the frame for the structure. Marta saw it before I spoke. "Do not rush," she said. "Men like your brother ruin themselves fastest when they believe they have already won." So I did not rush. For 6 days I became a patient man. I had always been patient with watches. I learned patience with people because the stakes had finally become worthy of the discipline. Through old clients, insurers, and one frightened junior accountant who had never been noticed enough by Julian to become loyal, I began to see the whole design. Julian had arranged a controlling investment from a luxury holding group in Zurich. The valuation depended on 6 high-profile restorations and 2 private estate contracts scheduled to be unveiled at a launch dinner in 3 weeks. Marketing materials had already been drafted. Advance press had been seeded. Claire had structured the deal so that the trust in the market remained attached to the Sorel name regardless of temporary leadership realignment. Temporary. How generous. There was only one problem. 3 of the 6 flagship restorations contained provenance statements, still pending final verification from the archive. One estate contract involved a military aviator's chronograph with disputed wartime documentation. And one museum loan, an Ottoman astronomical watch of absurd value and fragile legitimacy, had been moved into the investor deck as if its certification were complete. It was not complete because I had refused twice to sign it. Not because it was false, because it was uncertain. In our business, uncertainty is not a footnote. It is the entire ethical border. Julian had crossed it. Claire had drafted the sentence that let him pretend he had not. I spent those 6 days moving quietly. I met with 2 museum directors and informed them, confidentially, that the archive might be entering independent custodianship due to governance concerns. I spoke with our insurer and asked a very narrow question about coverage continuity in the event of certification authority being withdrawn from the operating entity. I arranged for the physical transfer of the original ledgers, my father's notebooks, and the brass seal to a bonded storage facility under Marta's control. I did not touch any client property. I did not fabricate anything. I did not need to. The truth, organized correctly, is usually enough. On the 7th day, Claire called. Her name on the screen made my stomach tighten with a memory my pride had not killed. For a second I saw us 10 years earlier in a pension in Florence, drinking bad wine from water glasses because everything else had closed and neither of us cared. Then I answered, "Adrian." She still said my name as if it belonged to a room only she could enter. "What do you want?" A pause. "I wanted to ask whether we can handle this with some dignity." I almost laughed. "We had dignity," I said. "You handled that." Another pause, shorter this time. "You were shutting down," she said. "In the company, in the marriage. Julian stepped in where you had already stepped away." There it was. Not apology. Narrative. People like Claire never confess first. They curate. "So you slept with him," I said. Silence. Then quietly, "This does not need to become a spectacle." That answered enough. I went to the window and looked at the lake. It was gray, hard, indifferent. "When did you decide I was a problem to solve?" "Adrian? When did it become efficient to bury me?" Her voice sharpened a little. "You want honesty? Fine. You worshipped your father's standards and expected everyone to live inside your mourning forever. Julian wanted a future. I wanted one too. A future. That word again. always so clean in the mouths of people standing on someone else's throat. "You should have just left," I said. "I did." "No, you looted first." She ended the call without goodbye. It hurt more than I expected, not because I still believed in us, because part of me had hoped betrayal would at least leave some sign of conflict in her. I was wrong. The launch dinner was held at the Beau Rivage in a private salon overlooking the water. Julianne always preferred rooms that already looked expensive enough to forgive lies. I arrived 10 minutes after the first champagne had been poured. Not late enough to seem dramatic, late enough to disturb the temperature. Marta came with me. So did Alain Mercier from the insurer and Dr. Sabine Keller from the Horology Museum Consortium, a woman whose expression could make trustees forget their own names. I had informed no one of their attendance beyond the bare minimum necessary to prevent security from behaving foolishly. Inside, the room was full of the exact people Julian had built his life to impress: investors with soft voices and hard watches, auction executives, specialist journalists, two collectors whose names appeared more often in lawsuits than in society pages, though Geneva politely pretended not to notice. Claire stood near the window in black silk, speaking to one of the Zurich men. Julian was at the center of the room, one hand in his pocket, smiling with his father's mouth and none of his father's discipline. For one moment he did not see me. I watched him inhabit my absence and understood something clean and ugly. He had wanted this long before he wanted Claire. Claire had simply taught him to translate wanting into process. Then he turned. His smile failed by a single degree. "Adrian," he said, loud enough for half the room, "I didn't expect you." "That," I said, "has been your recurring error." Marta did not smile, but her cane tapped once on the parquet. Julian came toward us fast enough to suggest confidence and slow enough to avoid looking alarmed. Claire remained where she was. That was her mistake. She should have crossed the room immediately and controlled the narrative with proximity. Instead, she watched, calculating. By then, calculation was too slow. "We can speak privately," Julian said. "No," Marta replied before I could. "That phase has passed." The room was quiet now in the polished, embarrassed way. Wealthy rooms become quiet when they suspect scandal, but are still hoping it will turn into a story about someone else tomorrow. Julian looked at Claire. She finally moved. "Whatever this is," she said, "this is not the place." "It is exactly the place," I answered. "You chose a public funeral for me. I chose witnesses." I took a folder from my coat and handed copies first to the Zurich lead, then to Alain from the insurer, then to the chairman of our board, who had gone suddenly pale near the far wall. "These are notices of immediate withdrawal," I said, "of the Sorel Certification Authority, archive custodianship, registered dial seal, and commercial name license from Sorel Atelier S.A., effective as of 1 hour ago." Nobody moved. Julianne blinked once. "You can't do that." Marta lifted her chin slightly. "He already has." Claire crossed the remaining distance then, reached for the papers, and scanned the first page. I watched her read. That was the nearest thing to mercy I offered either of them. No shouting, no theatrics, only comprehension arriving in real time. "The company still exists," Julian said. "Of course," I answered. "You still have desks, computers, debt, catering, but you no longer have lawful access to the name under which you sold continuity, nor the archive required to validate the pending certifications included in your valuation deck." One of the Zurich men opened his copy and flipped pages faster. Another asked, "What pending certifications?" I did not look at Julian when I answered. "The Ottoman Astronomical Watch, the Delacroix Estate Pilot Chronograph, the Vasseur Marine Repeater, and 2 additional private restorations represented as materially verified. Their provenance remains incomplete. Any implication to the contrary exposes the operating entity and its officers to immediate challenge. The room changed. You can feel that when power leaves one body and begins looking for another. It does not happen loudly. It happens like air pressure before a storm. Claire recovered first. She always did. "These concerns were under review," she said coolly. "Nothing in the materials stated final signature." "No," Alain from the insurer said, reading over his glasses. "But the underwriting extension was issued on the basis that certification authority remained internal and continuous. It no longer does. Coverage is now suspended pending reassessment." Julian took a step toward me. His voice dropped. "You planned this?" "Yes." It startled him more than anger would have. Men like Julian expect denial because they live there themselves. "I gave you half my life," he said. I looked at him properly then. "You were born in it," I said. "That is not the same." He flushed. For a second the room fell away and we were boys again in my father's workshop. Julian holding a polished case to the light, asking whether he could sign the inside. My father saying, not unkindly, "No, that part is for the man who did the work." I had forgotten the look on Julian's face then. Not sadness, a kind of early hatred, clear, private, patient. I should have remembered earlier. Claire folded the papers and turned to me in a voice only I and the nearest few could hear. "This damages everyone." "Yes." "Your father would never have wanted this." I met her eyes. "My father would never have wanted you in the archive at 2211 opening vault instructions you were never meant to see." That landed. Not visibly for the room, for her. A small stillness behind the eyes. She understood I knew more than the affair. I continued before she could respond. "Your access was logged. The envelope was photographed before and after. If you would like to dispute unauthorized entry while acting as counsel during a contested governance event, I encourage you to do so somewhere your current clients can hear it." For the first time all evening, Claire looked tired. Not guilty, not ashamed. Simply tired, as if the effort of maintaining superiority had become heavier than expected. Julian reached for her arm. She moved it away without looking. That was the moment I knew they would not survive one another. Not because I destroyed them, because the kind of bond built on shared appetite rarely survives first loss. The Zurich lead, a man named Brenner, closed the folder and said, in the dry tone of the professionally enraged, "This transaction is suspended immediately. I want a complete forensic review of all represented certifications, governance disclosures, and internal authorizations." No one argued with him. Money had spoken in the only register Julian truly feared. The rest unraveled without my help. Board members began speaking into phones. A journalist quietly left the room before anyone could stop her. One collector demanded confirmation that his consigned minute repeater had not been used in promotional materials beyond scope. Alain stepped aside to place a call his face suggested would be memorable for several careers. Marta remained at my side like judgment wearing wool. I should tell you that revenge felt glorious. It did not. It felt exact. And exactness has its own bleakness. I had not come to humiliate them. Not really. Humiliation was merely the shape consequences took when vanity had been central to the crime. I went to leave. Claire said my name once more. I turned. The room had thinned around us without fully dispersing. Enough distance for privacy to exist in theory, but not in fact. Very appropriate for her. "Was any of it real?" she asked. I considered pretending not to understand. Then I decided cruelty serves best when it remains truthful. "Yes," I said. "That is why this cost me something." She looked down. It was a small movement, the first honest one I had seen from her in weeks. Julian did not ask the same question. He knew enough not to. 3 days later, the board requested my return in an advisory capacity to stabilize client confidence. I declined. That surprised many people who confuse revenge with recovery. I had not done all that to sit again at the same polished table, across from the same kinds of men, and pretend the air had not been poisoned permanently. Instead, I completed the transfer of the archive into the Henri Sorel Trust, under the joint guardianship of the Museum Consortium and my office as independent conservator. The old townhouse atelier lost the right to the Sorel name within a week. The brass plate came off the door on a Monday morning before opening. I watched from across the street. Julian was inside when it happened. He stood in the entry hall while 2 workmen removed the name our grandfather had first mounted above a bakery. He saw me through the glass. For a second, I thought he might come outside. He did not. Some men only know how to fight when an audience can still mistake them for victors. The divorce was faster than anyone expected, and uglier in ways most people never saw. Claire wanted confidentiality, reputation shielding, and an agreement that neither party would discuss the private causes of dissolution. I gave her the first and denied the second. Not out of spite alone. Her conduct had intersected with governance and fiduciary matters. Silence would have protected more than dignity. It would have protected method. When she finally came to my temporary office to sign the last papers, she looked younger and older at once. Less polished, more legible. It was raining. She stood by the window after signing and said, "You always loved the work more than anything." That isn't true. Isn't it? No, I said. I loved what the work let me believe about people. She absorbed that without flinching. Then, after a long silence, "Julian thinks you destroyed him because you couldn't bear being replaced." I buttoned my cuff. "Julian needs motives that flatter him." Her mouth shifted almost into a smile, then stopped. "I did love you," she said. I believed her. That was another wound. "I know," I answered. "And you? You know that too?" She nodded. No apology came. None from me either. The older I get, the less interested I am in apologies from people who understood perfectly at the time. Julian called once near midnight, 2 months after everything collapsed. I almost did not answer. When I did, there was no greeting, only his breathing. Then, "Did Father know?" "Yes." A pause. "Did he ever love me less?" That question went through me more cleanly than any insult he had ever thrown. Because beneath all the tailored hunger, all the ambition, all the theft, there it still was. The boy holding a polished case in workshop light, asking to sign a place he had not earned. "No," I said. Another pause. "Then why you?" "Because he trusted me with what could be ruined." Julian laughed once, a broken sound. "You always did sound like him." "That was never the problem." He hung up. I have not heard his voice since. People later told the story in ways that made it easier for them to digest. They said I outmaneuvered my brother. They said my wife left me for ambition and paid the price. They said the old man had planned too well for the wrong son. People always simplify betrayal after the fact because complexity makes them nervous. It reminds them how often love and appetite share the same room before one of them locks the door. The truth is smaller and uglier. I was inattentive where I believed history would protect me. I thought inheritance was memory reinforced by law. I thought marriage was loyalty, disciplined by hardship. I thought my brother's resentment would stay manageable if I kept producing enough legitimacy for him to decorate. I was wrong on every count. What I did afterward was not noble. It was necessary. There is a difference there, too. I opened a new restoration office 6 months later in a quieter building near Carouge, above a bookseller who closes for lunch and never apologizes for it. No brass plate, no investors, no dinners, just 2 benches, proper light, one apprentice who still blushes when he makes avoidable mistakes, and the archive room below with temperature controls better than the old place ever had. The Museum Trust sends me work. Private collectors still find me, though I refuse more of them now. The watches are enough. They always were. Sometimes late, when the city has gone thin and the bench lamp is the only light left, I take out Claire's anniversary Patek. She returned it in the settlement. No note. No message. The clasp I repaired still closes with the exact soft click I wanted 10 years ago. I have never worn it. I probably never will. But I keep it in the third drawer under the timing papers because some objects become evidence of what we were before they become evidence of what was done. That is the real cost. Not losing the people. Losing the meaning of your own memories and having to sort them piece by piece like screws from a broken movement, deciding what can be cleaned, what can be reused, and what must be discarded no matter how finely made it once seemed. Do I regret it? If by it you mean the removal, no. If you mean the patience, no. If you mean letting them stand in a room full of money and certainty before the floor left them, not even a little. What I regret is older. I regret every time I mistook restraint for character in Julian. Every time I mistook intelligence for conscience in Claire. Every time I let grief make me passive and called it dignity because the word sounded cleaner. My father used to say a good watch does not forgive neglect. It keeps a record in tiny wear, in drift, in pressure that should not be there. Families are the same. Marriages, too. You do not arrive at betrayal in one great dramatic second. You arrive by accumulated permission, by one silence, then another, then a third you call temporary because naming it accurately would require changing your life before you are ready. I changed mine late, but I changed it completely. That is the nearest thing to triumph I can offer you. Not that I crushed them, not that I won. Only that when they tried to take my father's name by hollowing out the truth beneath it, I moved the truth out of reach and let the name follow it. Everything else was noise. Everything else was timing. And I have spent my whole life understanding timing.